Thank you for the nice introduction.
Yeah, just as written. Indeed.
It's a nice, this is a nice cozy crowd. I like this. Nice to be here in the home state of Justice Thomas to talk about the book. You know, I'm Kevin, by the way, just to separate. Sometimes we're doing radio, they tell us to say, I'm Kevin, he's Michael. Just a little bit of background about us. We went to college together, and, you know, we would have never thought, back then we put out an alternative newspaper and used to schlep that thing around and trying to get it published. It came out infrequently. We would have never thought we'd ended up at the Washington Post. Yes. Back then, we were Watergate babies. We got into journalism really as a direct result of Watergate, in some sense, when the journalism schools were packed. And so professors were always scaring you, saying, you know, look to your left, look to your right. You know, two of you are going to be driving cabs. We really took it to heart, you know.
Yeah,
we were out scrambling, trying to do whatever we could in college. So to be at the Washington Post and then to write a book together, not to mention that, you know, I'm the godfather of his daughter, and he's the godfather of my son. And so when people would ask us, collaboration is not often the easiest thing for books. People would always, how are you guys getting along? Many of our colleagues would collaborate on books, and we said, well, you know, we've known each other for so long, and we have no choice because, you know, I'm the godfather of his daughter, you know.
Right. We have to face one another.
Yeah, I mean, so we're happy to be here. The origin of this book, it really goes back to 2001, really. And we happened to be working on a magazine piece for the Washington Post magazine. And in 2001, actually on 9/11, we were in Savannah. After a couple of days of interviews, we had been in Pinpoint, making our maiden trip to Pinpoint in Savannah when the worst thing imaginable happened. On that very day, we were scheduled to have an interview with Justice Thomas's mother. Needless to say, that interview didn't take place. Everything kind of changed. The whole world changed. It took us about a year to kind of get back on track. I mean, we had a lot of duties at the paper. It took us a year to get back on track. And there was a period when we couldn't, our notes were cold. We didn't even know if we were going to make it to a magazine piece, much less a book. Our magazine piece was published in August 2002. It got a lot of attention, you know, from the right and the left. And we ended up getting a book contract in January 2003, and this is the product of that. We looked at Justice Thomas. We both have been reporters for a number of years and covered every level of government. I covered the first Bush administration, George H.W. Bush, and Mike is now covering the White House there. We cover local, state, national government, and really thought that Justice Thomas was one of the most fascinating figures in public life. Really, in many ways, we felt caricatured, not well understood, even though this was someone who had given, you know, hundreds of speeches, the most revealing speeches in public life. I mean, if you were to go back and mine the archive of his speeches, you could find almost everything you want to know about him. Nobody really gives speeches like that, where he talks about his childhood, his upbringing, color consciousness, the lingering pain of childhood slights, the kind of things that people in public life don't talk about. And yet he had been framed, I think, really by the right and the left as either a hero to the right or really a demon on the other side. And yet, even though he had been around for so long, he was really in some sense opaque. I mean, he was not, the contours of his life had not been fleshed out. And that's why we really chose to get into the book. I mean, as everybody here knows, he's only the second African-American justice. And just by that alone is destined to become an historic figure. And we felt like it was important to kind of take a look at him in a closer way. We mentioned in our book that we look at him through a racial prism. We examine his entire life because I think that, and Justice Thomas would say this himself, I mean, his life is really framed in some sense by his racial identity. That has been with him. He's been struggling with that. He has wrestled with that. It has defined him. It defined his rise, and it continues to define him in some way. But we examine every aspect of his life. We start right here in Georgia and pinpoint and chart his course through growing up in this small community that was a settlement founded by freed slaves, through Savannah, where his grandfather took him in after his house burned down and basically gave him an opportunity that most blacks at the time did not have in the Jim Crow South, growing up in segregated Catholic schools, but those Catholic schools were much better than the public schools, through his quest to become the first black priest, which is something his grandfather had hoped for him. He was in a minor seminary in Savannah where he first experienced racism, the first time he had been with white students, and it's something that's stayed with him and sears him even today. In fact, those who visit his chambers now are frequently treated to the yearbooks that he will pull down from the shelf when he went to St. John Vianney Minor Seminary, and where people would say when the lights were out, smile, Clarence, so we can see you. He will show the pictures of him being the only black student graduating from that class. He will sometimes take down the statue, St. Jude, patron saint of hopeless causes, that resides in his chambers now, but which he won way back as a student for winning a Latin bee. And it seems that he had put it on his drawer by his bed. This was the kind of school where you slept over, of course, and you stayed there through the week, all the way to the weekend. Someone broke the head off of the statue, and he glued it back on. And someone broke it off again. He glued it with thicker glue, and his message was that, you could break the statue, but you couldn't break Clarence Thomas. He still has that same statue from this Latin piece. So I say all that to say that, he's someone who, even though he has risen to this very top place, much of his early life continues to kind of inform him, and it continues to kind of live inside him. We pursued his life all the way through, the seminary, which of course he never went. He got detoured through Yale Law School, through his rise, through the Republican ranks, and all the way to the Supreme Court, where we talked to a great number of people who have never been spoken to before, many former law clerks, people who have interacted with him, people who have visited him in his chambers and have these long, revealing sessions, and including Justice Scalia, who he's often compared to, and often compared to him favorably, as kind of the lesser conservative. But Scalia had 3 lunches with us in which he tried to explain exactly his take on just that, and revealed that he thinks it's a slur on him that Thomas is called a clone of his, that it's not just a slur on Thomas. This is at the point of this conversation. I will, hand the baton to my colleague Mike, and let him pick it up.
It's funny. I think when you say Clarence Thomas, to most people in this country, they think about one episode, and of course that would be his confirmation and the allegations of Anita Hill. And in many ways, we believe that this seared Thomas in a way. Remember, this is a guy, as Kevin points out, who's already he holds on to slights and he holds on to wounds going way back to childhood. And imagine just, the total embarrassment of being, before the world accused of sexual harassment like Anita Hill, his former aide, accused him of. And, as you know, he made it through the confirmation process, but just barely. And you heard the sort of lewd testimony. It was a spectacle before the nation, really before the world, during that hearing, with all the allegations of what Thomas was said to have said. So he gets to the court. He barely gets through, the closest margin of any justice in over a century, 52 to 48. He gets to the court, and Clarence Thomas was totally exhausted and totally embittered and just sort of reeling in a way. And hoping that the court, I don't know how much people know about the Supreme Court, but it's kind of a sanctuary. It's a lot different than the rest of political Washington. You know, the White House, I cover the White House now, you don't have much access to the White House, but the president is trotted up for us, at least once a day, sometimes twice a day. So there's a kind of little bit of a back and forth. Congress, of course, is is wide open. You can, as a reporter, you can go up to a congressman and ask questions anytime you want to almost. You just kind of camp out off of the floor and you can talk to them. But the Supreme Court is different. Everything there is wrapped in tradition and ceremony. They do oral arguments 3 days a week. There's little interaction with the press. The press corps sits like in pews in the court chamber and just observe oral argument. That's the only part of the process you see. Other than that, you just get the written opinions. So Thomas was looking forward to kind of being in the sanctuary and trying to heal, trying to get over this searing experience. But immediately when he went to the court, he was confronted with a number of hot-button issues. There was a case where a prisoner in Louisiana, Keith Hudson, who we talked to for the book, he had been beaten by prison guards in Louisiana and actually took the case himself, sued his way from the Louisiana courts all the way through, and his case made it to the Supreme Court. It was just almost unheard of. And Thomas had made kind of a remark during his testimony, his confirmation testimony, that many people remembered. People worried about his empathy. They worried about Thomas's heart. And one of the things he observed, he said when he was on the appeals court, he could look out of his window and see prisoners being brought into the dock every day on those prison vans. He said he would look out there and say, "There, but for the grace of God, go I," because he knew he had been through a hard life and he had gotten some lucky breaks, and here he was on the court. So people were looking at this case, now that Thomas is on the Supreme Court, wondering whether he would show the empathy. He was clearly a conservative, but there was questions about how much of a conservative he would become on the court. And that one case, I think, set him on a trajectory that he hasn't changed from since. In this case, the court did find that this prisoner had been the victim of cruel and unusual punishment, but Clarence Thomas dissented. He said, no, that's not cruel and unusual punishment. It may be horrible. It's certainly objectionable, but a beating at the hands of prison guards does not amount to cruel and unusual punishment unless there's really severe injury, and he cited a number of precedents where he believed the court had gone too far in expanding the meaning of the Eighth Amendment. And that, Clarence Thomas was criticized for that broadly, for this one dissent, and it was just a marker for where Clarence Thomas would go over the next 16 years on the court. The New York Times memorably called him the youngest, cruelest justice as a result of his dissent. And Scalia, I believe, joined him in his dissent. Other members of the court actually criticized him in their opinions. And for Clarence Thomas, it was sort of like, that was shocking, just to sort of be on the court in this sanctuary, but yet be the object of criticism. And I think that's where it really started for Clarence Thomas, even though for all the controversy from Anita Hill and all of that, that's where Clarence Thomas began to be separated from the larger black community. And that's another wound that Clarence Thomas really suffers from and is apparently hurts from based on what he tells people in conversation and people tell us. So Clarence Thomas does this dissent, and that just was the first of a number of opinions where Clarence Thomas has been the most conservative justice on the bench. And Thomas, he calls himself an originalist. He and Scalia are originalists, and that means that they see the Constitution as not as an evolving document, but as a static document, one that you don't need to read in the current context of the times. You try to get the original understanding of what the framers had in mind when they wrote the Constitution. So consequently, Clarence Thomas is for the death penalty. Clarence Thomas is against affirmative action, which he believes is, you should have no kind of racial sorting. He doesn't think that the Constitution allows for that. Clarence Thomas is anti-abortion during and strongly so. I mean, he sees no right to privacy in the Constitution. And a lot of people, that raised a lot of eyebrows because Clarence Thomas, during his confirmation hearings, another memorable moment was when he was asked about Roe v. Wade and whether he had ever discussed Roe v. Wade. And Clarence Thomas said no, and that raised eyebrows. We even found in Harry Blackman's papers. His papers are at the Library of Congress, and when he died, they were opened up to the public. And Blackman, even who was the author of Roe v. Wade, was curious about that because Clarence Thomas was in law school at the time at Yale Law School, the nation's finest law school. And he said, He said to the oral interviewer, who was the dean of Yale Law School, it's odd. You guys didn't discuss Roe v. Wade up at Yale? And people were dubious about that. But, it was kind of the confirmation dance. Clarence Thomas didn't want to put himself out there as being anti-abortion, even though people suspected he was. But yet, when he got to the court, one of his earliest rulings was to sort of state flatly, it's kind of the most extreme anti-abortion position you can have as a justice, was to say that there's no right to privacy underlying, Roe v. Wade, and thus there should be no constitutional right to an abortion. Clarence Thomas, if he had his way with the law, he would devolve many of the powers the federal government has to regulate things like civil rights, the environment, things like that. He would put that in the hands of the states. And so this is the Clarence Thomas that we've come to know. And I think that's, it's all started with Hudson. Clarence Thomas kind of got, like I said, separated from the larger community. But for us, you look at his jurisprudence, it's one thing, but Clarence Thomas, the man, is something else altogether, and that's something else we try to discuss in the book. We talk about that. Around the court, Clarence Thomas is known as the justice most likely to have a random conversation with an elevator operator or a cafeteria worker. Clarence Thomas is like a very down-to-earth guy, in his day-to-day interactions, and that's something that people have a hard time reconciling with what they read in his written opinions. So anyway, I'm going to leave that there for now and read one or two things from the book, and then we can probably open it up to questions.
We'd love to get a discussion going, so we don't want to talk too long. It's kind of a prompt to hopefully that people have some questions. I think the paradox is really a very kind of important image as it relates to Thomas. And as Mike said, the Supreme Court justices, neither one of us had ever covered the court. And that was both kind of a blessing and an awful burden. It was a blessing in the sense that we didn't come with a lot of stuff crammed in our head, a lot of legal stuff and really insular stuff. We really were kind of trying to demystify this justice. But the court is really, in many ways, a strange kind of institution. I mean, the justices don't really even post their speeches. They're public officials. They get paid by us, but you can't find their schedule. I mean, you can find out with presidents going speeches. They don't post their schedules, not even their speeches on the court's official website. The Supreme Court, even in the 21st century, it still kind of operates in a kind of a anachronistic way. I mean, most of the filings are done by paper when most of the courts have gone to electronic. There was a fellow, interestingly enough, who we had interviewed. He was a Supreme Court fellow, and he's an academic from the University of Kansas. And so he spent this year in the court, and he was struck. And one of the things that made him think the Supreme Court is different, like no place else in government. He was at a lunch, and the late Chief Justice William Rehnquist was the speaker. And he finished his lunch and began to give his talk, and as this professor recounted, he must have smoked like 4 or 5 cigarettes, like in a period of like a 45-minute talk, and he's just thinking, most places in government you can't even smoke, and there's the justice puffing away right out there, and he just said, it's just a different institution. Most Supreme Court justices are not very recognizable. You go to the court, you're not going to run into them. But when you do run into Justice Thomas, most people come away with the same kind of image, so they can't reconcile the man that has been framed in public, the man whose opinions they read, with the man they meet. Tom Goldstein, who is an attorney in Washington, he had a practice for a long time to specialize in Supreme Court litigation, and had a session with Justice Thomas, and he said, I am no fan of his jurisprudence, but I am a fan of him. Our colleague, Bill Raspberry, now retired syndicated columnist for the Washington Post, Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist. His wife, Sandra, an educator in her own right, were at a 50th birthday dinner for Juan Williams, who's a correspondent at NPR and one of the early chroniclers of Thomas. And Sandra was no fan of Justice Thomas. In fact, she said when she was disappointed to have been seated next to him, to find out that her table she was going to be seated with. She says, "Boy, if I get a chance, I'm going to wring his neck." This is what she recounted to us. But during the course of this dinner, she found herself drawn to him, like many have. And she said by the end of the dinner, she said, "I wanted to go home and cook him a rabbit." And apparently this was one of the things that they got into in the childhood about how they used to eat rabbit. And so that's kind of this, unusual experience that people tend to have with the justice. And it's the subject of a lot of what runs through our book, just the contradictions that exist in a life. I mean, I think all of us would like to have our lives, displayed in full, and that's really what our goal. We didn't come at this through any kind of ideological perspective, and we're not, didn't write our book to try to be an apologist for Thomas or change anybody's thinking, but really to kind of more deeply inform people, because I think, everybody would like to have themselves rendered in more than one dimension. With that, Mike, you got something you want to read? Then I'll take a crack at it.
Okay. This is a little passage about Thomas's time in seminary. After the minor seminary, Thomas went out to Conception, Missouri, where he was going to pursue his grandfather's dream of his becoming a priest. But Thomas ended up leaving seminary because of a number of racist incidents, and I'll just recount one here from the book. And it's interesting, it's funny, when Thomas had all this stuff going on, you talked to his classmates, no one knew that Thomas inside was really feeling this kind of pain. That's an interesting thing about him. When you talk to people about him, you say, he seemed to be just one of the guys, and he seemed to be having a great time, and they're kind of surprised to hear, years later that Clarence Thomas was, felt wounded. So anyway, he's in Missouri. So outwardly, Thomas seemed to thrive here, much as he had seemed to thrive at St. John's. He was a fine student, notable for his self-discipline, which was needed to handle the challenging curriculum. He was also a standout athlete. He pumped iron in the seminary's recreation center, and his former classmates still marvel at his ability to throw a football more than 70 yards in the air. He played an enthusiastic game of basketball, even if he tended to over-dribble and his jumper was a bit erratic. But despite the happy appearances, Thomas was roiling inside. His seminary years presented a welter of contradictions, he would say later. The church was supposed to be about brotherhood and understanding, but instead he found racism and hypocrisy at every turn. His first roommate greeted him by opening a knife when Thomas entered the room. It was meant as a joke, and Thomas seemed to take it that way, but he never forgot the incident. Thomas also tagged along with Tom O'Brien, his best friend at seminary, to O'Brien's hometown of Kansas City for the weekend, often tagged along to O'Brien's hometown of Kansas City for the weekend. During one visit, the two went out to a Shakey's Pizzeria for beers. They sat quietly and waited for about 20 minutes. Finally, an employee came over and asked them to leave, complaining that they were making too much noise. O'Brien protested, but Thomas knew the deal. The place simply did not want to serve a black customer. Seething, he and O'Brien left. Thomas's turmoil came to a head on April 4, 1968, the day Martin Luther King Jr. was felled by a sniper's bullet in Memphis. The news devastated Thomas. He grew more distressed after witnessing a fellow seminarian's reaction when word of the shooting reached Conception. While walking into the dormitory, someone watching TV yelled that Martin Luther King had been shot, Thomas said. A fellow white seminarian who was walking up the stairs in front of me, upon hearing this and without knowing that I was behind him, replied after he had heard that Dr. King had been shot, "That's good. I hope the son of a bitch dies." Thomas was stunned. The episode crystallized all the misgivings he had been feeling both at Conception and earlier at St. John's. "I will never forget that moment," Thomas said years later. He called it an expression of his 4 years in seminary, when every day his consciousness was pricked by prejudice. Before the end of the semester, Thomas approached O'Brien and told him that he was leaving Conception. "I've run into too many rednecks," Thomas explained. Soon Thomas would abandon Catholicism as well. The racism he encountered at Conception was too much. How could people studying for the priesthood harbor such notions? How could the church tolerate them? The experience provided another occasion for Thomas to question the value of integration, something he continues to challenge. Segregation is immoral and illegal, he says, but government need not go so far as to try to foster integration through measures such as school busing. Black and other minority students can learn just fine outside of integrated environments, he says. Besides, who needs the kind of grief that he encountered at seminary?
One of the things that we would constantly find out things that didn't fit the common portrait of Justice Thomas. And one of those things was the degree to which he had relationships with black judges, and it helped black judges, many of them, most of them, Democrats. So I'm going to read a passage, one of those experiences that a black federal judge told us. Quote, "It was totally baffling to me," Federal District Judge Victoria A. Roberts says of her visit to Thomas's chambers in June 1998. Quote, "I didn't know how to take it. Here she was, a black woman who had been nominated to the federal bench in Michigan by President Bill Clinton, and she couldn't get a hearing. Republicans had held up her nomination for a full year. The reason? As president of the Black Lawyers Association in Detroit, Roberts had actively opposed the 1987 Supreme Court nomination of former federal judge Robert H. Bork, one of the right's judicial icons. That was reason enough for retribution a decade later," Roberts was told. Roberts was sent to Thomas by Damon Keith, a senior judge on the Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit and a Thomas friend. Keith, who had been appointed by President Jimmy Carter, talked Roberts up to Thomas. She was the first black president of the state bar, managing partner in a major law firm, somewhat of integrity. Thomas agreed to see her. Roberts changed her flight plans because of the Thomas meeting, arriving in Washington a day before her hearing. She spent nearly an hour in Thomas's chambers. He told her how he grew up listening to Motown artists and rattled off tunes by the Temptations, the Marvelettes, Smokey Robinson, and the Miracles. Quote, "I was very comfortable with him to my surprise," Roberts says. About 15 to 20 minutes into the conversation, Thomas abruptly stopped, Roberts recalls. "I've spent longer talking to you than I talked to President Bush when my name was submitted to the bench," he told Roberts. "To this day, I'm still not certain why or how I got this nomination." Thomas said he wanted to help Roberts. If Damon Keith was vouching for her, that was good enough for him. Quote, "The Republicans should not be surprised if President Clinton would nominate a person to the bench who would oppose Bork," Thomas said, according to Roberts. "If you can assure me that you can be fair, I'll make some calls." Keith recalls Thomas's phoning him and saying, quote, "You can tell her she'll be confirmed. I've talked to Orrin Hatch and Trent Lott." Lott, the Mississippi Republican who was Senate Majority Leader at the time, says he had a faint recollection that Thomas might have called him, adding, "I would hope that he would feel free to call if he had some information about a nominee that would be helpful." Hatch, the former Republican chairman of the Judiciary Committee and a close Thomas friend, says the story sounds familiar, but he can't recall details. All Roberts knows is that after her hearing, a Republican counsel to the Judiciary Committee approached and said, quote, "We've heard from Justice Thomas and you won't have any more trouble." And she didn't. On June 26, 1998, by unanimous consent, Victoria Roberts was confirmed by the Senate. At conferences of black lawyers and judges, she has told the story of Thomas's involvement, sometimes drawing raised eyebrows and perplexed looks. "He has, in his own way, helped me and others like me," Roberts reflects, "and we're on the bench and we're making decisions that may be very contrary to those he may make. Still, whenever Thomas's name comes up among her colleagues, quote, it's never good. He's a complicated person," she says, "very puzzling to me." We'll be happy to take some questions. Yes.
He's a paradox. He's a personable guy who writes these very conservative opinions that are contrary to a lot of jurisprudence that's gone on for 30, 40 years. How does he get along with anyone else on the court other than Justice Scalia, maybe Justice Scalia and Justice Alito? Do they get along?
Yeah, Thomas is a very personable guy, and people on his colleagues on the court seem to like him. But, it's interesting, the justices don't have but so much contact with one another. I mean, the analogy that's often given is that it's like having 9 separate law firms operating in one building. They meet for oral argument, they meet in conference to sort of talk about cases, make their decisions on cases. But to hone their opinions and all that, they deal, via memo. And Thomas doesn't hang out with a lot of the justices. I mean, he's not a big fan of high culture or anything like that. But he prefers to, he has an RV, he drives around the country during his off time. He has a 65-inch TV in his basement that he likes to, watch sports on. So he's not like Halsey with the other justices, but he's he's a really civil guy, and people like him just from their sort of day-to-day interaction, it seems.
Other than Justice, just to add to that, I mean, Justice Scalia said that often they sometimes commiserate, and chambers after they've been on a lot of those, of the losing end of those 5-4 decisions. There's probably a more favorable balance for him now in the court. Justice Breyer is another one who he has, we're told, has good relations with him. You see it next to him, and they are often into a kind of odd whispering conversation during oral arguments. And Justice Ginsburg, we're told, has taken a liking to his great nephew, and there's a personal relationship there. I think that Thomas is not all that comfortable at the court, to be honest. I mean, I think that when he got there, one of the things he found coming from the executive branch was that it was not quite, as Mike put it, I mean, there was not as much interaction with justices as he might have thought. I mean, many times, people don't know this, but many times, the justices never even see each other for long stretches except when they meet for conference and in oral arguments. Justice Stevens, who is, gotten up in the years, spends a lot of time in Florida. He has a home in Florida. It's possible now through technology for many of the justices to write opinions, at least to draft them, and really work from home, work anywhere really. So I think it's not as the environment itself. Interestingly, there was someone we spoke to who had visited him in the chambers and was surprised when he asked the question of how were things going. He got kind of a ho-hum okay, and he decided to pursue that line of questioning and asked him, well, how are you feeling about your job, and would you rather be doing something else? And Thomas said he would. I mean, he said that he would rather be owning a small business like his grandfather. I think there's kind of a wistfulness for doing something else, and his upbringing often comes up in the telling of his stories. He recently gave an interview to Business Week related to a kind of a look back at the Holy Cross years when Holy Cross first started letting black students in. Father John Brooks was kind of a mentor to many black students, was one of the ones who set that in motion. And so as a favor to Father Brooks, Thomas did the interview, and he talked about exhaustion. He said mental, physical, spiritual. He said every kind of exhaustion. And you often get the sense of a kind of a beleaguerment that the court has, kind of fostered on him.
Does he still do it because he feels called to be on the court, and this is where he's supposed to be because of his religious beliefs and his background, and his grandfather did all this for him, and he can't quit?
Well, interestingly enough, I mean, it wouldn't even put it past him to see him quit. I mean, one of his really good friends, J. Michael Ludick, who was on the Fourth Circuit and was someone who was on the short list for Supreme Court vacancies a number of times, just decided to quit abruptly last year and is now I guess he's Vice President and Chief Counsel for Boeing. And so one of his close friends, Larry Thompson, a former Deputy Attorney General, used to work with him in Monsanto, the chemical company in St. Louis, longtime friend, said that he would not be surprised if Thomas did something else. In fact, he said that, I guess Larry Thompson's from here. That's more significantly for this audience. Larry Thompson's from here. Still has a home here, because I know when we saw him, he was going back and forth from Atlanta to Washington. But Larry Thompson had said that, he wouldn't put it past that Thomas could do many other things. And in fact, earlier in his life, he said he wanted to be rich, wanted to be a multimillionaire. So usually public service is not the way to be a multimillionaire.
Yes. Okay. I'm sorry.
I've heard a lot of elder statesmen in the Senate and the House talk about the days when there was more congeniality between the two sides, the partisan side. And they talked about how compromise and decisions came about perhaps better because they listened to each other. Do you suppose there was a time when the justices perhaps have been more of a give and take before the final decisions were set down? Or have they always been isolated the way you described it?
I think they've become, just technology alone has kind of allowed them to be more isolated. You know, Thomas often works from home. I mean, and he'll draft his opinions there. But, I mean, that aside, and they do make a big sort of show of being able to, like, shake hands before every conference and talk to one another in a very civilized way. And they certainly hold themselves apart from Congress and the other branches of government where you kind of have this free-for-all all the time. So I don't know if there was ever less civility, but it's, as our federal institutions go, the court is still pretty, you know, they're congenial with one another.
They may be
within their limits.
Just to add to that, they may be congenial, but they have their own culture and their own politics. And one of the things that the late Harry Blackman's papers revealed, and his papers are the most recent available publicly, is the level of backbiting and the level of really sparring that goes on in shaping court opinion. I mean, there's a lot of, you know, attempts to trade back and forth. You know, you're still trying to get a majority. And so with only 9 people, a lot of those decisions really rest on one vote. And sometimes if someone does not quite, people will agree to sign on to opinion if they can get certain language of their own in there. And, you know, so there's always a lot of horse trading back and forth. It's a very delicate thing. And so I think there's an awful lot of politics that goes on at the court, but we just are not treated to it because we don't have access to it. The public doesn't have access to it, and you don't have very many people that are talking about it. On Capitol Hill, you can see it. You can approach members of Congress and play off one quote from, well, Senator McCain says this, and what do you say? And you also have aides. You have many aides accessible. I mean, the justices have 4 clerks, and those clerks sign a vow of confidentiality. And so there's it's a very tight institution to crack. And I think as a consequence, we don't really see a lot of the skirmishing that actually really does go on at the court.
And for them, they also have this culture where it's considered like a strong statement if someone reads a dissent from the bench. You know, it's, you know, just subtle things like that become a statement, or we strongly disagree. This used to, you know, word strongly becomes, you know, a point of emphasis for them. So it's a very kind of subtle institution. Justice Scalia is one who sometimes has stepped outside the bounds. I know he used to be very frustrated with Justice O'Connor when she was on the bench because he considered her kind of almost like a politician among the justices, you know, and someone who's willing to sort of use what he would call judicial half measures to get, you know, to an opinion rather than taking an opinion to its logical point, or the logical extreme. And he's criticized O'Connor in the text of opinions before, but that was considered to be, you know, a pretty strong statement.
What in Justice Thomas's background sort of shapes or is a predictor of how his judicial policy, the direction that he's had, which, you know, in most people's mind, I guess, kind of rolls back to judicial precedent for maybe 40 or 50 or 100 years. What about his experience, his intellectual growth, his experience in life leads to that kind of very conservative position?
Well, it seems like there are a number of strains that sort of like come together to kind of make Justice Thomas who he is. The first and most obvious influence would be his grandfather. You know, Clarence Thomas was born in Pinpoint, Georgia. Lived with his mother, brother, and sister. But at the age of 6, the home at Pinpoint burned to the ground, and his mother moved the family to Savannah. And when she couldn't quite hack it in Savannah, she had the boys move in with her father, Clarence Thomas's grandfather. And he was he was a successful man, had a fuel oil delivery business, ice delivery business, but he was also a hard, kind of rigid man of rules. And Clarence, you know, as a young guy, sort of rebelled against that some, but later in life kind of looked back on his grandfather and sort of his success. And he said, this is a guy who was able to prevail over the racial climate of the times to become a relatively middle-class guy without much of an education in Savannah, what were the ingredients that allowed him to do that? And it would be, things people would point to as conservative principles, his thrift, his perseverance, his hard work. He wasn't that concerned of, what's going on around him, even though his grandfather was a big contributor to the NAACP. His grandfather was an empathetic guy. He would give free oil to people who needed it. He had a farm outside of Savannah. He would raise produce and actually give bags of produce to people who he knew couldn't afford it. So, that's the first influence. And I think when Clarence Thomas went to law school, he's also a very class-conscious guy. I think some class consciousness crept in when he was at Yale Law School. He was one of 10 black students at Yale during his year. And he got there, he immediately kind of divided the class into kind of the kids from a working class background and the students from a middle class background. And he saw himself as being working class and felt that the middle class black students looked down on him and somehow held him in lower regard. And I think that also fed kind of his, conservative tilt. He looked at certain policies like affirmative action and said, who's really benefiting from this? It's the children of middle class black parents who are benefiting. That's how Clarence Thomas saw that. So that became another strand in this. And later he became a big follower of Tom Sowell, the conservative economist. Like during his first job, Clarence Thomas's first job out of law school was in the Missouri Attorney General's office. He was just an assistant attorney general. And he started reading a lot of Tom Sowell's work, and he actually went to St. Louis from Jefferson City, Missouri, to meet Tom Sowell one night. It was a 2-hour drive. He went out of his way to meet him, and he became a big fan of his kind of rugged individualism and the idea of, people's, kind of cultural patterns determining your outcome in life. So I think those are kind of the biggest influences.
Now, I would add one more, and I think you can't overestimate the impact that the confirmation process had on him, particularly the second hearings in which Professor Anita Hill accused him of sexual harassment. I think that was a humiliating, certainly the most humiliating episode, something that never happened to a judicial nominee right before the nation. And, this is a time, we're in 2007 now, 16 years ago. This is long before, a president was impeached and Monica Lewinsky and lots, and supposedly the workplace changed in terms of, workplace harassment issues. This was quite a while ago. And here was this man who was basically being interrogated by a panel of white senators about his sexual proclivities, all manner. I don't know if people remember how, just strange and in many ways riveting that was. And it really deeply affected me. It also played into some of the things that Mike just mentioned, just he really blames the, civil rights establishment in collusion with, other liberal activists, in collusion with my profession for making that happen, and for white senators for allowing it to happen. And so I think that really hardened him, and people have denied it. Certainly he has said he's gotten over it, but people have told us that he still talks about it. He still keeps a mental list of who was for him and against him, still discusses it. It's still on his mind, and he's still, I think, bitter about it. And I think that it has helped to kind of not allow him to consider alternative points of view.
You have a chapter, I've only read the first 4 or 5 pages of it, drawing parallels between Thurgood Marshall and never thought that there would be much parallels. And specifically, you mentioned, and you guys have been steeped in this, so you know it, that Thurgood Marshall was not thought to be a top legal scholar. That blows my mind. But I haven't read the whole chapter. Can you expand a little bit more on that whole thing? Obviously, most of us don't see much parallels here.
Yeah. Well, exactly. And the way we kind of frame it in the book is that, in one way, Thurgood Marshall became the counterpoint for Clarence Thomas. It's kind of he's the reason why so many people dislike Clarence Thomas. But the irony is, they both have been kind of mistreated by the process. They both had these arduous confirmation battles, and was sort of embarrassed, before that. They both have been accused of being followers of other justices. In the case of Marshall, it was Justice Brennan, who was kind of the liberal icon. And now people assume that Clarence Thomas follows Justice Scalia on the bench. Both men, the only two black justices, have been accused of having their clerks do most of their work. And you sort of look at these parallels, and it's sort of like, it is striking. Even though these guys, they come out on the opposite sides of kind of the philosophical spectrum, but their experiences have been very similar.
I think that the point of that was to say that, in a sense, that they were both treated as black men in some way by their opponents. And so they were framed by, they both share the being framed by the critiques of their opponents. And that's something that they would not agree about anything judicially. And make no mistake, there's no attempt to link them philosophically. But Thomas, who married a white woman, and there was a lot of whispering and talk about that at the time. But Justice Marshall married a woman of Filipino descent, and there at the time there was some whispering and talking about that. There was, both of the justices. Justice Marshall was certainly called Mr. Civil Rights and is probably more responsible than anybody for the legal dismantling of Jim Crow. Anybody in the history of this country, probably. And yet, he was not, at the time, when Black Power and some of the more militant activists, he was on the other side of that. He criticized Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael, and others at the time in the same way that Thomas has had his battles with the Jesse Jacksons and Al Sharptons. And so there are some parallels to him, but again, the attempt is not to carry that too far and not to carry it into the realm of the law.
Just one little comment on that, if you'll allow me to, and that is, Thurgood Marshall didn't have bitterness against his enemies, despite the fact that he really disliked where they came from.
No question. Yeah.
And I get the impression that Thomas has bitterness against liberals.
Yeah. Bitterness is in his soul, no question. And I think that it's bitterness that, again, I don't think you couldn't possibly overestimate what happened with Anita Hill, those hearings. I think that framed the rest of his life. And, there were skirmishes before. Also, let's remember, Thomas was, being most African Americans still vote Democratic, 90%. And Thomas was the most high-profile face of a Republican administration that's anathema to blacks, Reagan administration. So his elevation began there in the Reagan administration, and he had a case to do battle and say some things in his battles with civil rights leaders then that were very provocative. He once said the NAACP, there was not one good thing he could think the NAACP had done. He said all civil rights leaders do is bitch and bitch, moan and moan, whine and whine. So he had, at the time, some very provocative confrontations, and I think that helped, form this impression that exists now. That gentleman is eager with the pen to say something. You, sir, yes. Yes. No.
It's still, as you said, it was a close vote, 52 to 48.
Yeah, the closest vote of any justice. The closest vote in a century.
So the community at that time, I can understand his bitterness and stuff because he really had no friends.
Well, let me shed some light on that. President Bush originally wanted to appoint Thomas for the seat that Justice Souter had gotten. He was in some ways worried about exactly this issue of naming an African American and somebody that would not be considered of the same stature of Thurgood Marshall, and being accused because of some other civil rights issues that were being dealt with in his administration of basically being hypocritical, being against quotas, and then looking like he was replacing one African American with another. He was certainly concerned about that. At the time that Thomas was nominated, there were many people pushing for a Hispanic. Attorney General Thornburg was one of the ones who really was pushing and thought correctly, it proved prescient, that Thomas would get a very low rating of the American Bar Association. He got the lowest rating of anybody since 1955. And so there was concern that there would be attacks. But again, judicial nominations are as much about politics as anything. I mean, it's about getting who can get through, how can you isolate. The thing that they had going for Justice Thomas was that he was African American. And, so it worked in a sense. He was able to neutralize. They were able to develop what they called the pinpoint strategy, which was actually what it was dubbed, where they would emphasize his humble roots. They know that would have an impact on Southern senators who had large black constituencies. They bust up people from Pinpoint. They would work the halls and go around. They used to salt of the earth of the people. There was a lot that went on to that. And it also, the conservatives were mad at him for Souter. So Thomas was already becoming a darling of conservatives. I mean, Thomas at that point was somebody they felt would be a reliable conservative vote. And they were so disappointed in Souter. So they had kind of, in a sense, the best choice that they could. I mean, it took the NAACP and some other black organizations a lot of time to mobilize opposition to Thomas. And even at the time, if you go back and look at the polls at the time, there were more blacks who supported Thomas than not. Yes, ma'am.
I hear a lot of sympathy for him in what y'all are saying. And I think he deserves it for things that he's run into that were totally unfair. But I wonder, did you try to find out what was and was not fair? I mean, in particular, you raised two things that concern me about the hearings on him. One was the thing that at Yale there was absolutely no discussion of Roe v. Wade, and the other was the Anita Hill challenges. Were you able to determine, or did you try to determine where the truth lay? Did he lie?
Yeah, we have a chapter in the book entitled "Who Lied."
So if you can read that chapter, I think you will come to the conclusion that I think you will come to some conclusion. I think we have some, new information in there that provides context. I mean, what we say though is that ultimately on that issue of Anita Hill and Justice Thomas, I mean, there was no wiggle room in their stories, and only the two of them truly know what happened between them. Nobody knows but them, at least that we know of. I mean, in the 16 years, there have been no deathbed confessions by anybody, no diaries, nothing has happened, nothing has emerged, and frankly, I'm surprised. I mean, it's almost like John F. Kennedy assassination. I'm surprised. I mean, I'm surprised that something hasn't emerged that would shed light on it. But there have been two books written just on those hearings, and each book shed some light on it, but nobody really can prove what happened. I think what we did was we turned up some people who have not spoken before, and to give you some additional context. And in the case of Anita Hill, I'll just tell you this one little nugget, so then you can go get the book and read the rest. There's a gentleman, James Millett, who was a classmate of Justice Thomas at the Holy Cross. And he was looking at the hearings like a lot of people did. There were a lot of people who were watching the hearings who knew Justice Thomas. And the thing about Justice Thomas is that, there were people who testified and said he couldn't possibly have said those things Anita Hill said, because I've spent many years driving the back roads of Georgia with him, having dinners. I've been fishing with him. And if a man doesn't, talk dirty when he's fishing, he won't do it anyway. I mean, there were these things that people testified, and in their experience, that was accurate. But yet there were other people, and some of them were out there just watching television. James Millett was a guy who went to Holy Cross. He'd never been interviewed before, and hadn't had any contact with Thomas, once in Washington. And when Anita Hill, and probably the most provocative of her comments, talked about the remark that in Justice Thomas's office about the pubic hair on the Coke can, James Millett was struck by that, because he recalled almost verbatim Justice Thomas in a dorm room when they were there, going over to the dresser and picking up the Coke and said, somebody put a pubic hair on my Coke can. And think it was a joke, almost a verbatim comment. So he was really struck by that. Thought that maybe this is something the guy says. We had interviewed someone independently who said that he talked a lot about pubic hairs on Coke can. Not to turn this into too racy of a conversation. I forgot we have children there. My apologies. But, I mean, you asked that question. I guess the point is that you have context that you can build around it and try to make your decision about that. But I don't think that anybody truly knows but those two.
But another interesting thing from that episode is we went back and talked to some of Thomas's big supporters at the time, who at the time said that, if Thomas had done this, it would have been the worst thing ever. That would have been deviant behavior. That would have been, the mark of a, Jekyll and Hyde character. And now when you ask them about that, they kind of shrug it off, and say, well, what was he accused of anyway? Talking dirty? So people have now kind of minimized the crime, if you will, if it was a crime.
Excuse me, gentlemen, but in order to have time for book signing, we need to limit this to one more question.
Okay.
I think that gentleman has it.
As the presidential election moves onward in this country, and this only slightly relates to this conversation that you had, is Barack Obama possibly going to face the same kind of thing, of course, in a different situation, totally, much larger scale, of course, but is there, in your opinion, a good chance that he could eventually face the same kind of thing?
Well, I think maybe in some ways, this whole question of kind of, what makes you authentically black, I think is a question that Barack Obama already has kind of cropped up here and there around the edges of his campaign. And you hear people say that about Clarence Thomas because of his political leanings and his kind of judicial philosophy. People sort of take that critique all the way to the level of, what kind of black man are you? Are you some kind of sellout? So I think there's that parallel, but, I think Barack Obama's politics are much more kind of, mainstream, if you will, than Clarence Thomas's, at least, in the African-American community.
Thank you, gentlemen. We appreciate it.
Hey, thank you.